Well, good morning once again. I'll ask you ahead of time to sort of bear with me because I've been a little bit hoarse. I've had some chest congestion and still have some of it. And I'm afraid if I push my voice too much, I might lose it altogether. So I will ask that you sort of bear with me. But traditionally in this country, politicians have counted on the fact that most people have very short memories. That has been a great aid to many politicians, is the idea that most people have pretty short memories. They figure that the things that they're going to do, the worst things that they're going to do in terms of unpopular actions, they like to do at the beginning of their term, figuring that by the time the 4 years is up, people will have forgotten what happened, certainly 3 or 4 years earlier, and they'll be able to run again. Now, occasionally they get caught up in something, and people do remember. They make something so memorable that people don't forget it. That, of course, happened to President Bush when he, with his "read my lips, no new taxes," he made such a memorable statement out of that and emphasized it so much that, amazingly enough, people actually remembered that he had said it, and then it came back to haunt him when he raised taxes. Of course, politicians have promised not to raise taxes for years, and they've raised them. They've promised balanced budgets, and they haven't been balanced, and they've promised all sorts of things that they have not delivered on for one reason or another, because counting on the fact that most people notoriously have a very short memory. Short memories have seemed to be characteristic, and that, of course, can keep us from really being aware of what has transpired even in the recent past. We notice so frequently, and those of you, the older you are, the more of history you've lived through, the more you notice how about anywhere from, maybe 10, 15, 20 years after an event, how the history of those events begins to be rewritten. And you find yourself reading about events that you lived through firsthand, events that you were familiar with, events that you went through, and yet what is being reported about them 10, 15, 20 years downstream is considerably different from what you remember as a matter of first-person accounts. And history tends to be rewritten. If you go back and you look at textbooks, history textbooks, over a period of several years, if you could get some American history textbooks in increments of 20 years, let's say 1990, 1970, 1950, 1930, and you read about the same event, and you would find that a lot of what is reported takes on a different flavor, a different flair. Now, the events were the same events, but everyone sort of comes in, each generation of writers comes in with their own axe to grind and from the perspective of what's going on with them, and they attempt to rewrite it. And of course, most people, their memory is not that keen. They've sort of forgotten, have not really paid close attention, and so things slip on through. Now, this can happen not merely in the physical realm, not merely in the realm of rewriting history or of politicians relying on that to continue to get reelected, but it can happen to those of us as God's people. That's why there's so many warnings in the Scriptures to remember. Now, the Apostle Paul, in writing in the book of Hebrews chapter 2, says in verse 1, "Therefore we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things which we have heard, lest at any time we should let them slip." Now, that word "slip" is an interesting word. It is a word in the Greek language that means literally to run out, like something that comes out from a leaking vessel. If you've got a little hole in the bottom of the pot, how that what's in there gradually leaks out. That's the analogy that Paul used here we need to give the more earnest heed to the things which we have heard, lest at any time we should let them slip. We should let them just sort of run out. For if the word spoken by angels was steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a just recompense of reward. Now he has reference to the fact of the angels being used to deliver the law to Moses in terms of the statutes and judgments that you read of back in Exodus. If that word was sure and steadfast and received a just recompense of reward, how shall we escape if we neglect so great salvation, which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed unto us by them also that heard it? So we are warned not to let slip, and then we're told, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? It is easy for us as God's people to neglect, to become forgetful, to let slip, to let sort of drain away that God tells us we are to keep in the forefront of our mind. It is important that from time to time we step back and focus upon the awesome purpose that God is working out, and understand what God is doing and what we must do in terms of our response, and how that we can guard against forgetfulness. Because there are many admonitions in the Scriptures about growing forgetful, neglecting and letting slip. Now, the first part or the starting point of this is when you really understand the value of what it is that God proposes for us, then you recognize that we have something that must, under no circumstances, be allowed to let slip. How can we neglect so great a salvation if we really grasp and understand the greatness of that salvation? Now, in the sermonette, Mr. Zenon made comparison to man with God, and the fact that that our time, our days, are like a vapor. You know, the comparison of our temporary, quickly passing, transitory life with the existence that God has is such a total contrast. Notice in Psalm 8, in verse 1 it says, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth, who has set your glory above the heavens. So God's glory is set above the heavens. You and I look out and on a clear night, particularly if you're out in a rural area where you can look up and see the stars, and you see the glory of the heavens. And the glory of God so far transcends that. God's glory is set above the heavens. In verse 3, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained. When you look out and you consider and you think about all of the vastness of outer space, and you realize as you look out at those stars that the very closest stars are measured in terms of their distance from us by light years. That is the length of time that it takes light to travel. Now, light travels at 186,000 miles per second. It's not, per minute or per hour. That's per second. 186,000 miles per second. Now, if light is traveling at 186,000 miles per second, how far does light travel in a year? I haven't worked all the math through, but you can. You can just multiply 186,000 times 60, and you have how far light travels in a minute. And you multiply that number by 60, and you have how far light travels in an hour. And you multiply that by 24, and you have how far light travels in a day. And you multiply that by 365, and you have how far light travels in a year. And your numbers are getting larger and larger and larger. They are multiplying out in a vast, overwhelming sense. And our closest neighbors in the solar system are measured in light years. And as you begin to stretch on out, you're looking at hundreds of light years, thousands of light years, millions of light years. And that is something that is so vast as to be incomprehensible to us as human beings. Can you comprehend something that is so far across that it would take millions of years traveling at the speed of light to get from one to the other? Our minds sort of boggle at that, you know. We can't really comprehend that. God comprehends it. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have ordained. God is so great and so awesome and so powerful that God stretches out the heavens like a canopy. God designed and put into place all of the stars, all of the solar systems, all of the galaxies that exist. The vast and to us incomprehensible distances are very comprehensible to God. We're told that God calls out the stars by name. God calls them by name. He knows where each one of them is, and He has them named. God has stretched out the heavens. And we're told to consider the heavens, because that's a starting place to help us to sort of get in proper perspective of who we are by comparison to who God is, of our tiny lack of power when you compare it to the vastness and the greatness of the Creator God. There is so much difference between the little, tiny, puny things that we can do as human beings and the great, powerful vastness of the great God, our Creator. So the psalmist goes on in Psalm 8 then to ask the question. You start by considering the heavens and the vastness and the greatness and the wonderful things that God has stretched out. The moon and the stars which God has ordained, He set them there. And the moon is set at just the right distance from the earth. The moon has effects on the earth. It affects the moon's gravitational pull, affects the tides of the earth. People who live on the coast are get familiar with that, and how the tide ebbs and flows, and the differences that come in terms of the moon as the moon goes through its phases as it rotates around the earth, rotates on its own axis and revolves around the earth, and we see it from different angles as it goes through that give us the progression through the month as God counts time. God established all that, established all those laws that in a very intricate way. Then the psalmist says in verse 4 of chapter 8, he says, "What is man? What is man? Little tiny man. What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? For you made him a little lower than the angels, and have crowned him with glory and honor." You made him a little lower than the angels and crowned him with glory and honor. You made him to have dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. Now, when we look at the vastness that God has created, and yet we look then and we say, well, what is man? Why would God be concerned with man? And yet God is. What is man? What is man that the great God should be mindful of him? Man was made lower than the angels. Man has been crowned with glory and with honor. Man has been made to have dominion over the works of God. All things are put under his feet. Right now, that the psalmist says, all sheep and oxen, yes, the beasts of the field, the fowl of the air, the fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the seas, all these things are under man's dominion. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth. Now, if we go from there back to Genesis chapter 1, with the question in mind is asked in a poetic form here in Psalm 8, what is man that you're mindful of him? We notice in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 23, the evening and the morning were the fifth day. And God said, verse 24, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth after his kind, and it was so. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps upon the earth after his kind, and God saw that it was good. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. So God said, let us make man in our image. God had made the animals after the animal kind. He made the cattle after the cattle kind. He made the birds after the bird kind. God didn't say, let me make man after the monkey kind, or after the great ape kind, or the chimpanzee kind. God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. God made man not to be an animal, not after the animal kind. God made man after his kind, in his image, in his likeness. Man was given something that sets him apart from the animals. Man is set apart from the animals in what way? We breathe the same air the animals breathe. You know, if you deprive a dog of oxygen, in a matter of minutes, he'll die. You deprive a human being of oxygen, in a matter of minutes, he'll die. You deprive a cow of food and water, and, in a matter of time, they're going to die. You deprive a human being of food and water, and in a matter of time, that human being is going to die. What is it that sets us apart? It's not merely the size and complexity of our brain tissue. There's variations of the physical brain among various types of animals, and some animals certainly have larger brains in proportion to their bodies. There are animals that have larger brains than ours, and animals that have smaller brains. If brain size was all there was involved, the elephant would be smarter than us, because his brain weighs more than a man's. It's not just brain size, it's not just the complexity of the brain and the various sections of the brain, because there are variations that exist, and while man's brain has complexity that is further, that goes beyond what any of the animals do, it's not that much different. And yet the gap between human beings and animals is so great and so vast. Human beings are able to comprehend and to think on a level that animals are simply not able to do. Man is able to consider his days. Man is able to be inventive and creative, to imagine that which has not been and call it forth. Man is able to have a sense of himself in relationship to the universe about him, in relationship to God. God made man in his own image after his likeness. Now, that's not simply being redundant. There are two different aspects of it. God made man in terms of his image and his likeness, in the image of God, in the sense that man was made to look like God. Man was patterned after God. Now, God is a spirit. God is not composed of flesh and blood, but man was patterned after God, was made to look like God, and not only made in the image of God outwardly, made of physical substance, of physical matter, while God is composed of spirit. God took matter and He fashioned it, patterning it after Himself. But it was not just merely outward similitude, it was something on the inside. God made man after His image, after His likeness. Man was like God, in that man had creative ability and potential. Man had the ability to imagine and to conceive of things that have not been, to design them, to bring them about. Man has something that sets him apart totally from the animal world. God made man for a purpose. Our existence on the earth is not merely a not merely a matter of random chance. It's not merely a byproduct of evolution. God made man in His image, in His likeness, and He made man for the purpose of having dominion. He made man for the purpose of having dominion, of having rulership, exercising authority over the rest of creation. Now, with this as a background of understanding a little bit of who and what is man, let's go back to the book of Hebrews, chapter 1. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1, God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spoke in times past unto the fathers by the prophets. Different ways at different times, God revealed Himself. You know, we've looked at in recent times that God must reveal Himself to man. Man cannot discover God apart from the fact that God reveals Himself. You know, God makes Himself knowable to us because He gives us His Word and He reveals Himself. And He has revealed various things about Himself in the past through various prophets. But He has now in these last days spoken unto us by His Son, Paul writes, whom He has appointed heir of all things, and by whom also He made the worlds. Now, one of the things that is stressed in the book of Hebrews is the position of Jesus Christ. This is something that has been and was understood and not properly applied, because the world, even to this day, in its art, its religious art, which is a totally different matter when you get into the commandments and the second commandment against idolatry. But the world has tended to picture Christ as either a dead Christ hanging on a cross, or a little tiny baby lying helpless in his mother's arms. And Jesus Christ is not helpless. He's not a little tiny baby lying helpless in his mother's arms. He's not dead, hanging on a cross. But rather, He is our living high priest. He is living and functioning today. And He is going to return to this earth as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He is living in power and in glory. He is living in a glory that He shared with the Father before the world was. You know, He prayed about that in the prayer there prior to that evening in Gethsemane, that glorify me with that glory which I shared with you before the world was. You see, Jesus Christ was not merely a man. He was not simply a good man. That was, various ideas about Jesus Christ. Some view Him as a good man. He meant well. He was a good man. He was a teacher. He was somebody that went around doing good, and he was a good person. Maybe they even think He was the best person. Is that all Jesus Christ was? Was He simply a human being? Was Jesus Christ, who was He? What was His origin? Well, Jesus Christ was, as prophesied in the book of in the book of Isaiah, He was Emmanuel, which means literally God with us. God with us. He was God in the flesh. You see, God the Father, the one that we know as the Father, was revealed by Christ. He said, I have come to reveal the Father. Because the Jews of the Old Testament did not really understand who and what God was. They didn't really grasp that. They had a concept and an understanding that there was one God, but the understanding of really who God is and the real plan that God was working out was something that was only hinted at in the Old Testament. Rather, we're told that God, who revealed Himself in various ways in times past, has in these last days spoken unto us by His Son, whom He has appointed heir of all things, by whom also He made the worlds. So Jesus Christ was there before the world was. You see, in the beginning was God. That word is Elohim. It has been explained many times. The I am ending in the Hebrew language is a word that is an ending that carries the connotation of more than one. It is a plural ending, just like S is in English. Now, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. Who's the us? Well, in John chapter 1, we're told that in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. By Him were all things made. Without Him was not anything made which is made. So, here we find that the one that we know as the Father made all things, made the worlds through the one that we know as Jesus Christ. These two great beings that have existed through eternity, who had a relationship together that is something that you and I can't even begin to comprehend eternity, much less the vastness and the greatness of God, consisting of the one that we know as the Father, the one that we know as Jesus Christ, who came to reveal the Father. The Father, by Him, made the worlds. And we're told that in many places. You know, you could go to Colossians that brings out the same thing, where it talks about Jesus Christ in Colossians chapter 1, verse 14, that in whom we have redemption through His blood, even the forgiveness of sin, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. What does God look like? He's invisible to human eyes. Human beings, Jesus Christ came to reveal the Father. He is the image. He was the image of the invisible God. The firstborn of every creature. In other words, the one who has preeminence over all the creation. For by Him were all things created. All things were created by Him, that are in heaven, that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by Him and for Him. He is before all things, and by Him all things consist. He's the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, because He, as we're going to see in Hebrews, was actually the firstborn of many brethren, that in all things He might have the preeminence. For it pleased the Father that in Him should all fullness dwell. And having made peace through the blood of His cross, by Him to reconcile all things unto Himself. Coming all the way down, talking in verse 26 about the mystery that has been hidden from ages and from generations, now made manifest, which comes on down to being Christ in you, the hope of glory. We have the potential of entering into the very glory of God. Christ dwelling in us through the Spirit of God. To present, in verse 28, every man complete, brought to fullness and completion in Christ Jesus. God is in the process of finishing a spiritual creation. You know, the creation was finished in the physical sense, beginning in, we read of that in Genesis chapter 1. The physical part of the creation was finished, but there is a spiritual creation that is going on. That is made very very plain when in Galatians 2:10, when it says, "For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God has before ordained that we should walk in them." See, there's a creation that is still going on, a spiritual creation. We're created in Christ Jesus. We're His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God has before ordained that we should walk in them. God has before ordained that we should be made conformable to the image of His Son. God made us in His image after His likeness in the physical sense. He gave us capacity that sets us apart from the animal world. But it was for the purpose of a transformation and of bringing us to a level and plane of existence far beyond the physical realm. Jesus Christ came as the ultimate revelation of God. God revealed Himself in various ways through the prophets at different times, but now He has spoken unto us by His Son, whom He has appointed heir of all things, by whom also He made the world. Coming on down in Hebrews 1:3, speaking of Christ, who being the brightness of His glory, the express image of His person, upholding all things by the word of His power, when He had by Himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the Majesty on high. So Jesus Christ, the very instrument of creation on behalf of the Father, the very one who spoke, and it was done, who's called the Word, the spokesman, He came and purged our sins through His sacrifice. He paid the penalty in your stead and in mine. And He's not simply dead or disappeared, but through the power of God was resurrected to glory as the firstborn of many brethren. He sat down on the right hand of the Majesty on high, being made so much better than the angels. No comparison. As he has by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. For unto which of the angels did he say at any time, You are my son, this day have I begotten you? And again, I'll be unto him a father, and he'll be to me a son. See, some had the conception that Christ was sort of this super angel. He was a created being. And there are various religions that teach that. Jehovah's Witnesses teach that, among others, that the Archangel Michael that is mentioned in the Old Testament is the one that is Jesus Christ of the New, and that's not true. Various other groups down through the centuries have had various ideas and about who Christ was, and viewing him as a created being, as some sort of an angel or super angel. He has been made so much better than the angels. He's obtained a more excellent name than they. God never spoke to one of the angels and said, You're my son. This day have I begotten you. And again, I'll be to him a father, and he'll be to me a son. Again, when he brings in the first begotten into the world and says, Let all the angels of God worship him. Understand that worship is something that is given only to God. No one apart from the rank of God is worthy to receive worship. You find that when, at various times, in the book of Acts, you find, particularly among some of the Gentile peoples, with Peter or with Paul, that in some cases they were so overwhelmed that they fell down at their feet to do worship, and were immediately told to stand up. I'm a man just like you are. Don't worship me. You find in the book of Daniel, when Daniel was so overwhelmed in the presence of this angel that appeared, that he fell down in a worshipful pose before the angel's feet, and the angel told him, Stand up. I'm a servant of God just like you are. Worship is reserved for God. Worship is reserved for God, which gives all the more significance to one passage that I'll just call your attention to in Revelation 3. Understand, if worship is only reserved for God, what does this passage mean? Worship is not given to human beings, no matter how high their office, right here, right now. It is not something that is even due or given to the angels. All the angels are to worship Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ is God. Worship goes to God. Notice what it said. Notice what God said in Revelation 3:9 to the church, converted Christians. He said, Behold, I will make them of the synagogue of Satan, which say they are Jews and are not, but do lie. Behold, I will make them to come and worship before your feet, and to know that I've loved you. You realize that there is coming a time when God will make some. There's a time, according to Revelation 3:9, when we will be able to properly be recipients of worship. That's a mind-boggling concept, something that you and I can hardly imagine and comprehend. But let's go right on through Hebrews chapter 1. Verse 6, Let all the angels of God worship him. And of the angels, he says, who makes his angels spirits. Angels are also made out of spirit. And his ministers a flame of fire. He said, But unto the Son, he says, Your throne, O God. So the Son is also addressed as God. Your throne, O God, the Father says, is forever and ever. The scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated iniquity. Therefore God, even your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your fellows. So this is speaking of God, God the Father, and also of God, Jesus Christ, who is the Messiah, anointed with oil of gladness above your fellows, to stand out here. You, Lord, in the beginning have laid the foundations of the earth. The heavens are the work of your hand. They shall perish, but you shall remain. They do all wax old as a garment, and as a vesture shall you fold them up, and they'll be changed. But you are the same, and your years shall not fail. To which of the angels did he say at any time, sit on my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool? Are they not all ministering spirits, sent forth to minister to them that shall be the heirs of salvation? Therefore we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things which we have heard, lest at any time we should let them slip. Let them sort of leak out the bottom. The truth of God is precious. We have to give earnest heed, lest we let it slip. Now we're going to see a little later on what contributes to letting the truth slip away. For if the word spoken by angels was steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a just recompense of reward, how shall we escape if we neglect so great salvation, which at first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed unto us by them that heard it? God also bearing them witness, both with signs and wonders, with different miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit, according to His own will. God, as He chose, bore great witness. We read of it in the book of Acts in a very dramatic way. He backed up and supported the testimony of these individuals that bore testimony of the fact that Jesus Christ, who died, was resurrected after 3 days and 3 nights, just as He said that He would be. You can go back and read it in the Gospels. He said that He would. And there were individuals who testified of that fact. They bore witness of the reality that the same Jesus Christ that was laid in the tomb, as the sun set, and the 14th day of the first month, the day of the Passover, came to a close. And the 15th day, the first day of the days of unleavened bread, the first of the annual Sabbaths of God, as that annual Sabbath drew on, the Sabbath that the Apostle John describes specifically, that it was not the weekly Sabbath. He said that Sabbath was a high day. It was a holy day. Jesus Christ, the same Jesus Christ that died and that was laid in the tomb, was the first holy day of unleavened bread drew on. That same Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. 3 days and 3 nights later, when they entered that tomb, it was empty. And Jesus Christ, in power and glory, appeared to them and dealt with them throughout a period of 40 days. And they stood on the Mount of Olives and watched Him ascend up into the heavens until a cloud received Him out of their sight. They bore witness of the reality of that resurrection. That this man was whom He said He was. He was not simply a physical human being. Oh yes, He was a human being. One that was there and lived with them and dealt with them and talked with them for these years. But He was not simply a man like every other man. He said that He was God in the flesh. And the proof God the Father in heaven testified of that that authoritatively confirmed that they were speaking for God. They were used to write down this record that we had. Verse 5, unto the angels has he not put in subjection the world to come whereof we speak. But one in a certain place testified, saying, what is man that you're mindful of him? Or the Son of Man that you visit him? You know, we just saw what place this was testified. We read it at the beginning of the sermon in Hebrews 8. Or in Psalm 8, excuse me. Read it at the beginning of the sermon in Psalm 8. What is man that you're mindful of him? Or the Son of Man that you visit him? You made him a little lower than the angels, or you made him temporarily lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor and did set him over the works of your hands. You have put all things in subjection under his feet. For in that he put all in subjection under him, he left nothing that is not put under him. But now we see not yet all things put under him. This word for all here is a word that means just that. It means everything in all directions. Some modern translations render it the universe. Because ultimately, that's what God has for us. Now, we don't yet see all things. Right now, we're over what we see man over, are the physical parts of creation, the animals, all of the various parts of the physical creation. But that is merely the beginning. Man was made to be over all things. We see Jesus, verse 9, who was made a little lower than the angels, or temporarily lower than the angels, for the suffering of death. See, man was created lower than the angels, but for the purpose of being set over all of the works of God. We don't yet see man over all of the works of God. Man is not yet ruling the universe. We saw Jesus, who was made a little lower, or for a little while lower. He was temporarily made lower than the angels for the suffering of death. Because angels don't die. They were created to live forever. Our destiny is not simply to become an angel. No, that's sort of the proverbial idea the world has. If you be good, you'll go to heaven and be an angel. You know, kind of sprout wings and you float around and you'll be an angel. If you're bad, well, you know, you go to the other place and sort of horns stick out or something. And so we, tell little kids that they're a little angel or they're a little devil. Well, man was not created to, that's not man's destiny. Man was created to be put over all things. Man was created not after the angel kind, but God created man in His own image, after His own likeness. What we see, though, is that Jesus Christ temporarily was made lower than the angels in order to suffer death, and we now see Him crowned with glory and honor, that He, by the grace of God, should taste death for every man. He died in our stead, for it became Him, for whom are all things, and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons unto glory. Not just one son unto glory, many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect, complete, full, through sufferings. For both He that sanctifies and they who are sanctified are all of one, of God, God the Father. For which cause He, Christ, is not ashamed to call them brethren. Christ is not ashamed to call us brethren. We're called to be sons of God, younger brothers of Jesus Christ. Saying, as it's recorded in Psalm 22, I will declare your name among my brethren. In the midst of the church will I sing praise unto you. And again, I'll put my trust in Him. And again, behold, I and the children which God has given me. For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, He also, Christ Himself, likewise took part of the same, that through death He might destroy him that had the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. Truly, He took not on Himself the nature of angels, but He took on Him the seed of Abraham. Christ didn't become an angel. He became a human being. And what kind of a human being? Wherefore, in all things, it behooved Him to be made like unto His brethren, that He might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of the people. For in that He Himself has suffered, being tempted, He is able to succor them that are tempted. Jesus Christ knows what it's like to be a human being. He knows what it's like to struggle with the feelings of humanness. He took upon Himself the weakness of flesh. Wherefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our profession, Jesus Christ, who was faithful to Him that appointed Him, as was also Moses, faithful in all his house. Going through and talking about this, and how that there's something very important that we must never lose sight of. We need to give the more earnest heed to the things which we've heard, lest at any time we should let them slip. You know, if we don't really grasp the magnitude of what God has called us to share life with Him. God has called us to have a relationship with Him. God is in the process of bringing many sons unto glory. And it is if we don't grasp the magnitude of what God is working out, of what God is accomplishing, when and why do we let something slip? Because we lose sight of its significance, we lose sight of its value, we lose sight of how precious it is. If you know that something is very precious, you keep your attention on it, and you don't lose it. You hold on to it. If you have maybe a piece of jewelry, or you have something that has great value to you, you keep up with it. You don't lose sight of it. You don't carelessly just leave it around wherever it may be. You keep up with it. It's precious to you. It's important to you. We allow things to, as it describes here, to slip away or to sort of leak away when we lose sight of how important and precious it is. We're warned here in verse 3 not to neglect so great a salvation. You know, when we look at it, we find that these warnings are over and over. Our people nationally have certainly forgotten God, and we as God's people, His church, can also find our memories growing dim. We could go back to Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea and various places where it talks about forgetting God and having forgotten God, our Creator. That's what our nation has done, of course. The nation has lost sight and forgotten. Well, what about us? Don't those same tendencies of forgetfulness apply to all of us? Not only has the nation forgotten its God, let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6. Notice in verse 12. Beware lest you forget the Eternal, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Beware lest you forget. Beware lest you let slip away the precious awareness of God and His calling and His plan. Now let's notice what we're told here. Because Deuteronomy chapter 6 deals with forgetfulness. And as we notice, we'll find that there's some keys here to avoid letting God's truth slip. There are some keys to not growing neglectful of the great salvation God has given us. In Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 1, now these are the commandments and the statutes and the judgments which the Eternal your God commanded to teach you, that you might do them in the land where you go to possess it, that you might fear the Eternal your God, to keep all His statutes and His commandments which I command you, that your days may be prolonged. Hear, O Israel, and observe to do it, that it may be well with you. Verse 4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. These words which I command you this day shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently unto your children. You'll talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk in the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. Bind them for a sign upon your hand, and wear them like frontlets between your eyes. Write them on the post of your house and on your gates. It shall be, when the Lord your God shall have brought you into the land which He swore unto your fathers, to give you great and goodly cities, houses full of good things, all these wonderful things. When you have eaten and are full, verse 11, when you're prosperous, when you have plenty, when things are going well, that's when we're warned to beware lest you forget the Lord, which brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. The most dangerous time for forgetting God are the times of prosperity. The times when things are going well. It's very easy to grow complacent and to take God for granted. Things are sort of going along, and we forget about God because it seems like that we're able to meet our own needs. We're able to take care of ourselves. Beware lest you forget the Lord, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. How do you avoid forgetting God? How do you avoid growing complacent in times of prosperity, when things are going well, when things are relatively peaceful? And we think we have hard times. We have very easy times by comparison to the kinds of times that most people have lived through down through the centuries, the kinds of times that many of you have lived through, particularly those of you who are older, way back years ago. The abundance, the prosperity that we have right now is still vastly more than what people a couple of generations ago experienced. We live in a time of relative peace, at least where most of us live. How do you avoid letting slip away, becoming neglectful? We let slip through neglect. That's part of what Hebrews 2 points out. How do you let slip away? How do you let it slip away? Primarily, we let it slip away through neglect. Why do we neglect it? Because we lose sight of how precious and important it is. Verse 13 tells us the first thing. Says, notice there are positive injunctions here. After he tells us, beware that you don't forget. Verse 13, you shall fear the Eternal your God and serve Him. You shall swear by His name. You shall not go after other gods of the people round about you. For God is a jealous God. He is not one that, says, well, go ahead and worship all these others as well. God requires exclusive loyalty and allegiance. Now, the first thing we're told that we shall do is that we shall fear the eternal, our God, and serve Him. The first thing that we're enjoined is that we must stand in continual reverence and awe of God. We're to fear God. That's what it means. Doesn't mean you get scared and go hide in a corner because you think God's going to get you. That's not the kind of fear of God that the Bible speaks of in these contexts. It's talking about being overwhelmed with the greatness, the power, the grandeur, the awesomeness of God. Of really grasping how great God is. And when we understand that, the great God that stretched out the universe, the great Creator, we're to continually go back and focus in on the greatness and the power of God. We're to fear the eternal our God and serve Him. We are to have this desire to please God. Understanding who God is. Understanding God's greatness, God's power. Not to be sidetracked by all of the things that are gone after by the world around us. So we're to stand in continual awe and reverence of God. So I think one of the things that's very helpful to that, it's mentioned many times in the Scriptures, and it's something that in our urban society we don't do very often, and that is consider the heavens. Take time to step outside and on a clear night and look up into the sky and think about the great awesome power that flung out the heavens, that stretched out the heavens like a canopy. There is something that very much helps to sort of put us in perspective when we stand out and look at the vast universe that God has created. I think that's one very important way, because many times you read in the Psalms how the psalmist says, when I consider the heavens, the work of your hands, when I look up and see this, it helps me to realize how great you are and how tiny I am. You see, that's a very important key to fearing God, when you realize how great God is, how tiny and powerless we are by comparison. Then our relationship with God is right. The next thing we're told in verse 16, you shall not tempt the eternal your God as you tempted Him in Massah. So the second thing we're told is something we're not to do. We're not to tempt God. Now let's go back and notice what they did at Massah that is that we're told not to do. What is it God didn't want done? Well, as you come back here, we'll find it in Exodus 17. Now, just hold your place. If you come back a little earlier, in Exodus chapter 13, we find the story of God opening the Red Sea. A dramatic miracle. Now, God has just gotten through working all the miracles that are recorded, in the first part of Exodus, the plagues on Egypt. And then finally, the culmination is He opens the Red Sea, and Israel comes across dry shod. You think about what that means. Their foot was not going to slip on slippery ground. God doesn't put His people on slippery ground. We're told not to let the truth slip away. And God does not put His people on slippery ground. God brought His people over dry shod. He brought them across on dry land. They didn't bog down. They didn't slip and slide and fall. You know, normally, if you just suddenly could pull the plug and pull all the water out of a pond, what would happen? You try to walk across. Well, number one, what would happen is you'd probably bog up, have trouble walking across, get bogged down, because it'd be so muddy, so mucky. You're standing on something, you know, what happens to everything that's been underwater? Any old logs or rocks or anything, well, they're slimy, and you try to walk on those and you fall off. They're slippery. You know, God brought His people across, and He prefigured a lot of things in the way that He did it. One of the things, this is an aside, not the main point, but it is something to understand that the way God leads us is not a way, God is not going to lead you, in a way to bog you down and cause you to slip and slide all over the place, where you can't maintain your footing. If you're following God, you're going to follow. God's going to lead you in the paths of righteousness, and your feet will be on solid ground. And if you're bogging down and slipping and sliding, then somewhere or another you got off the path. You got off the track, and you better get back on it. Because God's not leading you if you're bogging down and slipping and sliding. You need to find out where the path is. And this book is the book that tells us. So we have that story in Exodus 13 and 14. As God brought them across, they rejoice and sing the praises of it in chapter 15. And in verse 22 of chapter 15, Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea. They went into the wilderness of Shur, went 3 days' journey into the wilderness, and they didn't find any water. And they came finally to Marah, and they couldn't drink the waters there because it was bitter. People began to murmur and say, "What shall we drink?" Moses cried out to the Lord, and God told him to cast in a tree, and the waters were changed from bitter to sweet. And God then said, "I want you to recognize that I am the eternal, your God. I am the eternal that heals you," as it says in the end of verse 26. You know, I'm the God that has the power to turn bitter into sweet. I am God that heals you. And I want you to recognize that. So they encamped there by the waters. Then they took their journey and they came on into the wilderness of Sin. And by this time it's a month after they departed from Egypt. And now they began to murmur against Moses and Aaron and complain because food was getting short. And so, verse 4, God says, "I'll rain bread from heaven. And I'm going to prove whether you're going to walk in my law or not." So He told them that there would be manna every day. They were only to gather a day's supply, but on the sixth day, a double portion would rain down because He didn't want them going out procuring food for themselves on the Sabbath. You know, they weren't to go out scouring the countryside and getting up manna at that time. He'd give them a double portion on Friday, and that'd be the only time the manna wouldn't go bad if it was kept over. So here was a dramatic miracle. So sure enough, it worked out that way. Describes the manna. God sent quails there in verse 13. And then the manna came. And so it describes all of this here in chapter 16. And when the Sabbath came, Moses told them in verse 23, "Tomorrow is the holy Sabbath to the Lord. You do your preparation, you bake that which you'll bake, and seethe what you're going to seethe, and what remains, lay it over to be kept up in the morning." You know, there's a lot of work involved, and cooking was an all-day project. He's not talking about sticking something in the microwave for 30 seconds. That's not what's involved. He's not talking about opening up a box of dry cereal and pouring it and putting a little milk on it. He's talking about, when he says preparation of the meal, he's not talking about, sometimes, some people think they prepared a meal. They prepared the whole thing. They got the TV dinner all the way out of the freezer, and they stuck it into the oven by themselves, look what I fixed. That's not what's being described here. We're talking about, effort that was involved in what is concerned. And the Sabbath is not the day to be doing that sort of thing. It's not a day that is to be consumed by the physical necessities of life. That's not the day that we ought to be spending our time on procuring the physical necessities of life. That's the day we ought to spend our time procuring the spiritual necessities of life. So we have the day before as a preparation to get ready, you see, for the Sabbath, so that we can concentrate on the spiritual part on the Sabbath and not be spending the day doing all these physical things and spending ourselves from morning till night feeding the flesh. So Moses told them tomorrow's the Sabbath, and you eat today, and today is the Sabbath. On down in verse 25 and verse 26. So, sure enough, verse 27, some went out on the seventh day looking for manna, and they didn't find any. Amazing. God had told them there wouldn't be any. Some of them didn't believe it, Well, it's been there every other day this week. I don't see how come it won't be there tomorrow. I want mine fresh. I don't want that stuff left over from yesterday. How do I know it's going to be good today? I'm going to go out and get me some fresh manna. They didn't find it. God said unto Moses, how long refuse you to keep my commandments and my laws? Now, he hadn't even given them the Ten Commandments yet. That's you don't get to Mount Sinai until a few pages later. Till a month later. Before we, or actually, not a full month, but at least a couple of weeks later. God's laws were already in force and effect. The Sabbath existed from the time of creation, not simply from the time that God gave the commandments on Mount Sinai. That's why he said, remember the Sabbath. If I got up and made an announcement that you had never heard before, I wouldn't start off by saying, now, you remember so-and-so. Well, you couldn't remember it if you hadn't heard it before. Well, they didn't. So anyway, God testified through a powerful miracle. So now we come to chapter 17. They pitched in Rephidim, verse 1, and there was no water for the people to drink. And they murmured, verse 3. And they complained. In verse 7, the name of the place was called Massah and Meribah, because of the chiding of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the eternal, saying, is the Lord among us or not? When we're told back in Deuteronomy 8, or back in Deuteronomy 6, not to tempt God as they did at Meribah and Massah, what you found at Meribah and Massah was the fact that in spite of all of God's working through them, the way that God had testified of His working in their lives down through this period of time, they come to a problem, they come to a crisis, and immediately their attitude is one of doubt and disbelief, and I don't know if we can trust God, and how do we know, and oh, woe is us. Ready to forget everything God had showed them up until then. God had been revealing Himself to them, revealing His power, revealing the fact that He is the God that we can count on. As soon as they came to a problem, they didn't count on Him. You see, what goes hand in hand with forgetting God, being forgetful, letting slip, letting slide away, is the fact that first and foremost we cease to really stand in awe of the power of God. We cease to continually become impressed with God's greatness. We begin to chide and to murmur because God doesn't operate on our time schedule, allows us to sometimes find ourselves in adverse circumstances. And so we fall into this attitude of doubting disbelief, not trusting God, not counting on God. As the Israelites didn't count on Him when they got to Massah, immediately they began to gripe and complain. Is the Lord among us or not? How do we know we can count on God? Well, you know you can count on God because God is God. So that's the second thing we're brought out here in Hebrews chapter 6. We're told to fear Him in verse 13. We're told in verse 16 not to tempt Him as they did at Massah. In verse 17 we're told the third thing that we're told you shall do. You shall diligently keep the commandments of the Lord your God, His testimonies, His statutes, which He commanded you. You do that which is right and good in His sight, that it may be well with you. Verse 24, God commanded us to do these statutes, to fear Him for our good always. So the point is obedience to God. Diligently keeping God's law. You know, prosperity leads to complacency and forgetfulness. That, of course, is described in detail if you wanted to sort of read the story of the church at Laodicea in Revelation 3. That's an example of complacency leading into, or of prosperity leading to complacency and forgetfulness. We live in a society that is complacent and that is forgetful. How can we avoid being complacent and forgetful? How can we avoid letting slip away the precious truth of God? Letting slip through becoming neglectful of the great salvation that God has offered. You know, if we don't keep in mind how precious and how great it is, we begin to neglect it. And when we begin to neglect it, it begins to slip away. Our attention is diverted elsewhere. And the prosperity with which we're surrounded leads to complacency and forgetfulness. We've got to continually stand in awe and reverence of God, not to get into an attitude of doubting disbelief and questioning the veracity of God's Word and God's promises, but of recognizing that God testifies of Himself. And He's testified of Himself in working in our lives and opening our minds to understand His truth. If we keep that in mind, and if we diligently keep His law and observe God's ways, seeking to follow His ways, then we're doing those things that will not let our foot slip and slide. We're told in Hebrews 10:23, let us hold fast. Let's go up. Let's pick it up here in verse 19 of Hebrews 10. Having therefore, brethren, boldness to enter into the holiest by the blood of Jesus. We can come directly into the presence of God the Father, by a new and living way which He has consecrated for us through the veil, that is to say, His flesh. And having a high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart, in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience, our bodies washed with pure water. Let us therefore hold fast, not let slip through neglect, but let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering. For He is faithful that promised. And let us consider one another to provoke and to love and to good works, to be concerned about one another and to seek to stir one another up, to love, to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, not drifting away and becoming careless. As we have opportunities to assemble before God and hear the truth of God, something that's very easy for us to take for granted in our age. Realizing that down through the centuries, so many of God's people so rarely had that opportunity. Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, so much the more as you see the day approaching. Brethren, we need to hold fast to the profession of our faith, not growing neglectful of the great salvation God is giving us, not allowing to slip from our grasp the precious truth that God has called us to be a partaker of. Because you and I wouldn't understand the truth if God hadn't called us and opened our minds to it. Don't neglect it.
Don't let it slip. Hold fast. Because God is faithful. He promised.